Well, thank you. Really glad to be here. As I told some of you earlier, it's my third time in Barcelona. First was 20 years ago. The second, I think, was exactly 10 years ago. So I'm buying tickets for 10 years from now. Hopefully the prices, if I buy it 10 years in advance. Now we pencil it out. Yeah. Pencil it out. 10 years from now, I'll be walking with a cane and, who knows what I'll be talking. And very glad to be back here. The city seems to get, nicer and nicer every 10 years, or continues to get continuously nicer, and as do the people. So what I'm going to be talking about is some sort of mixture of, I said, keynote, and I never know what keynote means. You're allowed to have equations, not allowed to have equations. It's always, so it's a mixture of kind of a keynote and just kind of a regular paper, and you can decide where in that convex combination it is. So it's going to be based on joint work mostly with John Williams, but also with Jacob Maloney and John Turner, and I'll talk a little bit about the two main papers that I'm talking about, how they relate. So let me start with the motivation. If you've been following it, even very loosely, that the telecommunications industry or sector is really undergoing major changes. And really even what we used to consider kind of very different industries, like you can think of cellular phone and cable companies and others, they seem to be this kind of all sort of convergence, merging, both kind of horizontal mergers, vertical mergers, a lot of kind of policy issues related to that. And I would claim that a real big driving force behind that is the importance of data services. Okay, and that's really what's leading to a lot of these changes. And in terms of data services, the use of the internet and data is really growing at astonishing rates. If you look at residential broadband usage in terms of gigabytes, has grown about 34 to 40% annually over the last 20 decades, over kind of a sustained period. Early on, it was about file sharing. Recently, it's about what's called, over-the-top video. So think of, Netflix, YouTube, all these other services that you can get video that's kind of in addition to your kind of linear regular TV. Now, in terms of broadband capacity, it's largely kept up with pace, and there's been a lot of investment. So according to the FCC, about 1.5 trillion over the past 2 decades. Okay, and you can ask whether that's a large number or not. I don't know. To me, anything involving trillions of dollars is large, but maybe not, depends on relative to what. And there's also been a lot of interest in terms of new private entry. Google in the US, even though they're still very small, they've been really pushing to create fiber to the home networks. And also public municipal broadband networks. That's kind of another interesting trend. Now, even with that though, congestion still periodically leads to slowdown of networks. They're not working as good as they should. And my focus today is going to talk about congestion. I'm going to talk about what's called the last mile. Because in networks, there's really essentially 2 places where there can be congestion. One is essentially where the networks, right? So think of a cable provider. I always tend to say Comcast, because that's the big one everyone knows in the US. But think of whatever your local cable provider, how they connect to the rest of the internet. Okay, there can be congestion there, right? Or there can be congestion literally getting to your home from whatever kind of the local node is, and I'll talk about later. I'll be talking about this last mile, this getting to your home, okay, and talk about some of the economics of that. Okay? So there's been a lot of policy debate. Let me just give you some of them, and there's a bit of a flavor, a little bit of difference in the US and Europe, although some of the same issues come up. So in the, some of the issues come up are issues of pricing. So for example, in the US, one of the issues, or what some providers would like to start putting, is data caps. So basically you have an allowance of gigabytes that you can use, and you get charged after that, right? The way that some cellular phones, work on and off, whether they have that or not. Big issue, a lot of consumers groups don't like that. Issues of zero rating. What does zero rating mean? If you have those caps, the question is, do some things count towards them and some don't? Okay? If you have that zero rating of saying things are not going to count, does that violate things like net neutrality? Okay, which is another big thing that's kind of so further down the road. Unbundling and tying practices. So the question is, if, for example, your provider that gives you the video service is now also selling your internet service, does that create any conflict, any potential for foreclosure? Okay, these are kind of things that are in the background in terms of pricing. Entry. Big issues there. Google Fiber, municipal broadband, I talked about later. There's an ever-evolving choice set, evolving over-the-top video that's constantly coming in, More and more there's discussions that you could get various TV channels, you can now get them as by subscription. So ESPN, which is a big sports network, there's discussion that one day they'll offer a service that you could just pay them directly, and then you will download basically through your internet service, and that's the way you'd watch them rather than through the TV. What that's led to is cord cutting. So more and more in the US, you see households that just say, we no longer pay for TV, we're all going to pay for internet. We're going to pay maybe a little bit extra and get a little bit faster internet, and that's how we're going to watch our video, through Netflix and other services. And that's a problem for some of the internet service providers. And then cellular, more and more is actually becoming an option. So in principle, if you actually look at LTE, what is it, generation 12 or whatever they're called, their theoretical speeds are 600 megabits per second, okay, which is significantly higher than what you can actually get with cable. Okay, so very soon, right, we used to talk about there's a monopolist coming into your home in terms of a video provider. That's maybe no longer true. Theoretically, that's not true anymore. The networks themselves don't support these theoretical speeds, but that's going to be around the corner very soon, right? And at that point, you might say this whole landscape is going to evolve because now we're going to have multiple ways of competing, getting your video, and how that's going to change. Okay? There's been a lot of high-profile mergers in the U.S., similar ones I know in Europe. And of course, regulation, there's net neutrality, there's the whole issue of opening set-top boxes. I don't know if that's actually been an issue here, but in the US, the boxes that you have that basically allow you to get the video service, typically they were only coming from your internet service provider, but more and more, basically you're going to have competition in that and alternative ways of viewing video. Anyway, these are basically a lot of the policy issues, and we can talk about a lot of them, but up to now, most of the economic debate has been theoretical. So you can write sort of models to say, this is good, this is bad, you know, these are the considerations you can think of, but there's actually been very little data. I mean, I actually, you know, I sat, when I was at the DOJ, I sat at meetings at the very highest levels at the administration, talking about, you know, policy on the internet kind of broadly defined, and very quickly realized there was a lot of people talking about theory. There's people who brought their industry experience, okay? But again, very little of it was actually based on hard data. The government has almost nothing. Companies have a lot of data, but don't know really how to do anything with it. Literally the point of, and I'll tell you some stories later, of not even knowing how to create descriptive statistics that are useful for their own use with it, so they don't really know. And up to now, there really hasn't been much academic work using this rich data. So our main goal in this project, and I say project is described over, you know, at least the 2 papers I'm going to talk about, but then future papers as well, is to really try to bring some facts and empirical analysis to this. So a big part of, just one second, a big part of what I'm going to do today, and we can go on and on. I mean, Massimo was asking me how long I'm going to take. I said, well, really depends how much time we spend on the descriptive tables, because I'm going to have a lot of those. And part of it is just, they're very simple numbers, but just to show you what do the data actually look like. So that's a big part of what we'd like to see. But then, you know, we're carving away at trying to get some economic questions and address them as we go along. Okay, so.
Just to fix that, yeah. Yes, there are lots of issues here, obviously, but is it mostly about competition and the issue that, you know, prices may be causing, you know, quantities to be too low in some sense, or there are other issues like some kind of technological match, or, I mean, net neutrality aside, so are there, or can, by and large, can we think about it as mostly the issue of worrying about competition?
So, yes and no. For some of these, yes. But the stuff that I'm going to be talking about, it's really not going to be as much about competition. It's going to be taking the competition as given and ask, are there things, so I'm going to be talking probably more along of the pricing, although not exclusively about pricing, but saying, taking the competition, taking the structure as is, are there things that we can be doing to better improve the way that traffic is managed on the internet? And I'll say in just a second, I'll show specifically the questions we're going to talk about. Massimo?
I just wanted to reinforce what you have just said from the European perspective, which is that in Europe there is also another debate, which is that politicians in many member states and also at the European Union level have made claims that everybody should have, I don't know, 100 megabytes per second everywhere, or at least 95% of the population, etc. And And actually, there are many member states which are literally subsidizing billions
Right.
to the existing telephone companies in order for an expansion of the network and make it higher capacity. And there is not a single empirical work which is supporting that.
Right. That's very useful to know because, and to tie the two things together, a little bit of what we're going to be talking about on both of these papers is two different aspects of it, but exactly addressing these types of questions, like what is the willingness to pay for speed? What is the willingness to pay for a fiber network? And showing some of those, and we'll actually have, especially for the questions you just asked, somewhat not really contradictory points, but we'll actually show kind of two different aspects of the same question. Okay, but let me kind of get to that. So what is this talk going to be about? So I'm not obviously going to tackle all of those issues. So it's going to be based on two papers. One was already published, which was looking at usage-based pricing and demand for residential broadband. So in that paper, what we did was we actually asked, what are the welfares? This goes back to one of these issues of if we actually put a usage-based pricing, we're going to treat it as a three-part tariff, right? To basically say, what happens if you do put an allowance to try to limit kind of people who are creating a lot of externalities by using a lot of demand, try to have them pay, what are the welfare benefits from that? Welfare benefits or gains. So we're going to look at that. That's one. But part of what we did there was also just estimate demand. So to ask, what is the willingness to pay for speed? Is it, doing a cost-benefit analysis of a gigabit fiber network, is that actually worth paying? And there we actually found that there is some wedge between the social willingness to pay, so if you can basically integrate under the demand curve, and the monopolist's ability to price because they cannot price discriminate. And we actually found there was a significant wedge in the returns between the social returns, or how many years it took you to recover the social returns, versus the private returns, right? So there we actually said there was maybe some scope to intervene and kind of put in these additional networks, because it looks like privately the firms, because they were not able to price discriminate more than they do to really get those returns. Although in the second paper we'll show that actually purely investing in building big highways and not using them in a smart way is not efficient. Okay? And that's the second paper. What we're going to be looking at, and this is a working paper that's just kind of getting ready for submission, is going to be talking about congestion and economic solutions to it. Okay? And most of the numbers I'm actually going to focus on are this paper, although I'll talk about some of the results from the earlier paper as well, because there is some overlap. Oops. So what's a general research strategy here, which is kind of common for both papers, and I'll try to distinguish. So first is we have high-frequency usage data for a panel of subscribers. So in the second paper, we're going to have 45,000 households. And what we're going to get for them for 11 months, we're going to see their, not just daily usage, we're going to see their usage by the hour. Right? Usage here is going to be gigabytes. Okay? But I'll actually even tell you from a different data source where we know we can actually separate. It's not just about gigabytes. We can literally know what you use those gigabytes for. Okay? So I'll show you some evidence for that, but the main data is not going to have it. So we're going to provide a lot of very detailed descriptive analysis of that relationship. And I know from giving these past talks, I can spend over an hour just going over those numbers, and there's a lot of questions, and I'm happy to spend as much as we have. So that's the first part of kind of both of these papers. Then what we do is we use that data, flexibly estimate a model of demand for residential broadband. And kind of the key elements of the model is the following. First, we're going to try to estimate kind of willingness to pay. Now you could ask how you're going to get willingness to pay. Right? How you're going to get how much are consumers willing to pay for something. So there's two things you could do. One is you could say you subscribe to different plans, and that tells me how much you're willing to pay for a plan that has certain characteristics. Okay? But there's a limited amount of that we can do. By the way, I can make these slides available instead of, we can use the that technology instead of having to take photos. But that's one thing that you could use. The other is you could use, in our data, what we have is going to be three-part tariffs. So it means you have an allowance within a month of a certain number of gigabytes, which means that during the month, right, so once you hit that allowance, obviously you have a per gigabyte price. But before you hit that, there's a shadow price of realizing what's the probability that I'm going to hit it. So we're going to use that variation to estimate demand. Okay, and part of the descriptive statistics, I'll actually show you that consumers seem to respond to that type of variation. Okay? So we're going to use that. That's going to be the price variation that we're going to see basically how price sensitive consumers are. The other thing is I'll show you there's huge amount of heterogeneity. It's actually, it's kind of, you could think it's almost trivial to say it, but it's amazing once you see it in the data. Consumers are heterogeneous in pretty much every possible way. You know, how much data they use, how that fraction is between peak and off-peak usage, how much variance there is from day to day. Pretty much any way I'd cut the data, massive amounts of heterogeneity. So we are going to want to have that included in the model, and we're going to do it in a very flexible way, and I'll show you how. Okay? The model I'm going to focus on today, what we're going to focus on is not just how much you use during the day, which was our first paper. Here I'm going to focus on how much you use between peak and off-peak. Okay, and I'll show you in just a couple of slides why we're going to focus on that. Okay, and then we can use that to compute things like willingness to pay to speed, for allowance, stuff like that, to do the type of cost-benefit analysis that we talked about before. But we can also conduct counterfactuals like how much, you know, what are the welfare implications of usage-based pricing? That was one of the first papers. Or benefits from having fiber to the premise. So I have a lot of acronyms here, you know, but basically having a fiber all the way to your house, what are the welfare benefits from that? Or to examine various economic and technological solutions to some of these congestions. Basically think of peak use pricing, and you'll see in a second why I'm going to talk about that. Okay? So,
can I ask you a question?
Sure, please.
Echoing what Massimo was asking, so a lot of these investments in infrastructure are sticky. They last for many, many years. And let's say in 2007, if you asked me how much am I willing to pay for, I don't know, tripling my internet speed, maybe I would pay a lot, but there's a chicken and egg kind of situation where what you're estimating is probably underestimating.
Yeah. So in our first paper, that was one of the issues we had to deal with, of saying, you know, given current technology, here's how much people are willing to pay, but it's probably an underestimate. So there what we found was that it was actually socially, you know, at least estimates we had. So we did a lot on the benefits, very little on the cost, but what we had from the cost, from industry estimates, suggested that the return to investment, you could recoup that in, I forget the exact date, but we're talking something like around 20 months, so less than 2 years, even with that underestimate. So that's what we kind of said. It's not that we're, you know, this was not the exact estimate, but this was kind of an underestimate, and we thought if anything, this would be, but just to give you an idea, there we estimated, and I forget the exact numbers off the top of my head, but the social returns you'd actually recoup in about 20 months. Privately, it was about 150 months. Okay? So you could say, well, even privately, you'd recoup it once you took into the account, you know, dynamics, but the point was there was this big wedge in between them, right? And that was the point. So let me just talk one thing about identification kind of generally before I talked about, you know, specifically here. One of the things you might ask, well, you want to study some of these things, why don't you just go and directly look at the data and see what happens? Well, part of the problem is, and this actually is a perfect lead-in, your question actually ends up is a perfect lead-in for this, is to say some of the stuff we don't actually see in the data. So for example, I'll be talking about shifting demand from peak to off-peak, and that actually involves some technology that we just don't have in the data. So you can't just directly look at the data for effects of what would happen if you lift this constraint or not, because there's a lot of constraints that are just not fully lifted. So what we're going to do is we're going to use an economic model and compute a counterfactual. And it's really sort of important when we talk about identification is really understand how we're going to identify the key parameters. And, you know, I'll kind of talk a little bit about that maybe kind of later on. Okay, so I thought I might have skipped a slide here, but I thought I had a slide of the peak usage, but I'll show you that in a second. So what I'm going to do in this talk is two things. First, I'm going to present descriptive statistics about this kind of high frequency data. Then I'll kind of outline the model, and I have, you know, one slide just giving the broad outline, then I can go into details. We'll see how we're doing for time and how much I want to go into both the outline and the estimation, and then I'll talk about, you know, some of the results and the implications. And, you know, I have way more slides than I have time, so I'll kind of go by that according to the interest and so forth. So feel free to stop me at any point for questions. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit about the data before we go to the descriptive. So the data comes from a North American internet service provider. Over, you know, the years, I've used quite a lot of times, you know, data that were confidential, I couldn't share. I've never had to write as strict as an NDA, a non-disclosure agreement, as I did with these guys. They are paranoid about even saying who they are. So we're not allowed to say anything more than they're North American internet service provider. You'll see some of the graphs that I gave you don't actually have numbers on the axes. And the reason is even if the plan is describing their plans, they're paranoid that that might be enough to discover who they are. Although there is one graph here that I'll point to. I was surprised that they let us go ahead with it, but apparently they did. But they're quite freaked out about that. The data includes bytes both in the upload and the upload and the download direction, and basically packet drops and delays and various kind of measures of quality. And I think the very raw data we have literally at 15 minutes intervals, but you'll see we're going to aggregate that up. It covers roughly 45,000 different subscribers for basically February to December of 2015. So we have kind of 11 months. Overall, I think if you aggregate to the hourly level, we have something like 330 million observations. So we definitely have to aggregate it a fair bit. This data is called, the technical is IPDR, but basically what it gives us besides kind of the bits that they get is also which node in the network they connect to. So the way that internet residential broadband works is basically there's the internet service provider, the data comes in, then they split it to literally a node, and from the node there's about, between 200 to 400 consumers that connect to a node. Okay? Now what happens is, and we'll talk about that later, is that if you're connected to a node, right, so I'm on Carlos's node, and Carlos, we all know, is constantly downloading these huge, massive data sets. He creates an externality on me. Okay, so it actually slows me down, and that's kind of one of the things we'll be looking at in terms of kind of the effects that that has.
So the node is a zip code, basically?
It's much less than a zip code because it's 200 to 400 consumers, and it's basically based on your, it's usually kind of a city block, a little bit more depending if you're, what area you're in. We'll also know from the network kind of the average network node utilization, basically how much it's worth. So I told you before about how little these guys know about the data. So one of the, not actually no, it's not this service provider. So we have 3 or 4 service providers we're working with, and we use the data depending on how reliable they are. So one of these guys, actually a very big guy, gave us their data, and part of why they gave the data, they were saying, we're constantly getting complaints that our network is slow, but our engineers telling us it should be fine. It's satisfying, there's experiments on how it should be working, and according to them, our network isn't that congested. Yet our consumers are constantly complaining. So it's like, what's going on? So they gave us the data, and we started just, creating these descriptive statistics, just looking at it. And one thing we noted was that the congestion variable was top-coded at 70%. It never exceeded 70% at the node. So node was never over 70%. Now, according to engineering estimates, over 80% is when it starts slowing down. Over 90 is essentially not usable. Okay? But they were saying, it was never going over 70. Now, they never looked at that. All they looked was average congestion. Okay? Now, we can ask them, well, why is it top-coded at 70? They're like, well, there's no reason. They went to the third-party vendor who was collecting the data. It ends up there was a software problem. Right? What they wanted was to tell them, flag to us every time it goes over 70%. What the data provider understood was top-coded at 70%. Okay? So they were paying millions of dollars for these data, and they were getting something when they average it out, saying, it's not very congested. Well, yeah, guess what? If you're going to top-code it at 70, it's not going to look very congested, right? You know that the upper bound on the average is not going to be over 70, and if 80 is when you're going to start worrying, yeah. So that shows you a little bit of how little anyone knows kind of in this. It ends up they fire this. Here's a funny follow-up story. So this fall I'm teaching an MBA class telling them exactly the story. One of the guys comes up to me later and says, I worked as a summer intern for Comcast, the largest cable company. He said, this summer they discovered they have a similar problem. Okay, this was like, we discovered 3 or 4 days for one of the other guys. Okay, it ends up this third-party vendor was actually apparently didn't correct it globally, went and did the same thing. Okay, this is the type of information they have there. Okay, we also know the billing records, so you know what plans, how much people are paying, and we're going to use actually data from another internet service provider to actually provide to show you where these guys are, where they go, not just gigabytes, but where is it that they actually use when they go on the internet. Okay, so let me start kind of showing you kind of some stuff from the data. So this is what the plans look like. So what I have here is the monthly usage in gigabytes, and this is the total payment. Now note here, nothing on the axis. Again, that's the part I couldn't reveal. So what you see here is a consumer pays a monthly amount just to get on the plan. They get an allowance for free. And then after that, they pay a per gigabyte charge. You see that line's actually very steep because for this internet service provider, again, I can't tell you the exact amount, but it's a very steep amount. You really don't want to be in this part. Okay? I mean, and you can see just from the proportion of it, it's significantly more than kind of the average cost that you would pay here. Okay? These here, that's, again, I can't tell you the speed. So what we have here is the relative speed. So this is normalized to be 1, and then everything is relative to the speed of this guy. Okay? And you can see here, you know, the second highest plan is, you know, twice, 3.5, and 7 times the speed. So that's kind of what the structure is here. One of the things I should point out, and that's going to be important, you can see here that allowance and speed are kind of collinear. They move together, which is a little bit unfortunate for one thing, which is if you're going to ask me later, do consumers choose the optimal plan? Okay, I can have a test of that, okay, but a very weak one, because I can really only test in one direction. I can say there's someone over here that's paying a lot in allowance. Okay, so say that someone here, right? They're paying more on if they were on this blue plan than they were on the red plan, right? And getting a lower speed. What I can't say, if there's someone that's, you know, way over here that's not using a lot of their allowance, would actually be better off on the green plan, right? Because yes, they'd be better off, but they're also have a lower speed. So I can't identify, you know, are they here because they're suboptimal and we'd be better on here, or that's what their preferences are. So we're actually going to assume that they have a preference for speed to rationalize their choice. And what we actually saw was that there's very little violations of this type, someone being up here and going, I mean, and that's the point we'll get to later. Okay, in terms of usage, so this is the usage that you get on these tiers. And a couple of things to note here. First is, these are the very popular observation. Here in observation, if I remember correctly, this is a month, no, this is daily. Sorry, so this is a day household. Okay, so you can see we have, you know, 8.5 million household days on just this plan 1, plan 2, and you can see they're significantly, you know, this plan 4, which is the highest allowance, highest speed, is significantly less popular. One of the things the plans do well is you can see they kind of very clearly sort out the consumers according to their usage. Okay, so whoever pays for this higher plan are the higher usage, right? And you can see it across different quantiles of the distribution there. The other thing to note from here is just the massive amounts of heterogeneity even within a particular tier, right? So if you look at this tier 1, right, there's the 25 percentile use, you know, basically 0 to at least 1 decimal point, right? I mean, it's obviously not 0, right? So these are people that, you know, kind of do a little bit of email, not much more than that, and go all the way to the 99th percentile, which are actually using, you know, quite a bit. Now remember, this is on a particular day, right? So these are people who decide one day their average use could actually be quite low, but they just decide, I'm going to watch 3 high-def movies that day, and that's how you get up here, right? So there's a lot of heterogeneity across household days, and here I haven't separated how much is household, how much days, right? Even within a tier, let alone across different tiers. Okay, so that's kind of one dimension of this massive amount of heterogeneity that we'll get to. Okay, how much of the monthly allowance do people utilize? Okay, so this is important for 2 things, just in terms of descriptive, but also in terms of, remember I told you we're going to use this dynamics. So for our dynamics, you want people to go over or at least get close to the allowance, because otherwise, if you know there's 0 probability that I hit my allowance, there is no shadow price, right? There is no dynamics. So in our previous paper, we used another internet service provider. We had about 15% of people. There we just had 1 month who were over. Here, in any given month, only 2.5% exceed. So it's actually not that high. And you can see most people, you know, don't even get over the 50%. So there, you might say, hey, there isn't much dynamics here. Well, but if you look at over the 11 months for each household, what is their maximum? So here what we do is we use all billing cycles. Here for just each household we use the maximum. So there's 1 observation per household here. You can see that the maximum, there's much higher probability of exceeding your allowance, actually exceeding it and definitely getting close to it. Okay, so what we would say is, if you look at that, there is a significant, just 1 second, there's a significant probability of exceeding, and not only that, once you exceed, that price is pretty high. So even if the probability is not that high, the expected payment is quite high, enough to impact your dynamics. Yes?
Do you observe some household switching into higher tiers?
So we don't. They can in our house. It actually ends up that the cost of switching is not very high, and you can do it mid-month. So actually, if you see there's certain months you say, hey, I'm getting very close to my allowance, it ends up you can pick up the phone and call these guys and switch. Very few people do that. Over 11 months, only 5% of people do any switching. So most people, they're really, get stuck or stay in their plan. We're going to basically assume that once you're on a plan, you stay on it, partly because it's a real mess to model otherwise. But that's what we're going to assume because that's what's in the data. You don't actually see that much switching.
And a related question, how much do consumers know where they are? So let's say, sometimes you get the message, you've exceeded it, you have to pay 30 euros, it's too late, basically.
Yeah. So on these providers, they actually do two things that really help you. One is if you're on a computer, you can go in real time and you could put like a little meter app type thing on your computer to literally tell you where you are. The other thing is you can get a text message that the default is when you're, I forget if it's 75 or 80%, and remember that number because I'll show you a graph in a second that's related to it. You get an app, that's the default, but you can even tell it, have other things. So tell it, when I hit 50, the equivalent of, Massimo raising, you have 5 minutes left, you can have, you have 10% left or whatever, you can get that app. And that's built in. And there's a default, if you do nothing, you get it at either 75 or 80. So that's two things that they do here. And what we'll see is people respond, and maybe they respond because of that 75 to 80%. Okay? Okay. And actually, here's the graph that was started. So one of the things to ask, do consumers respond to dynamics? So in one of the papers, we actually looked and really ran a regression of kind of a household level regression and see whether you responded to what the dynamic problem would be, the state variables, which are how far along you are in the month and what fraction of the allowance you've used. And we just kind of ran think of it like a reduced form policy function regression, and you could definitely see it responding the way you'd expect. What we did here was just a graphical representation of that, and that is to see what happens, basically the difference between the last 2 days of the month and the next 2 days of the next month, right? So think of when a month hits, you get a restart on your clock, right? So you go from having a shadow price, maybe 0, to getting a different shadow price, right? So you get a restart on it. What happens? So, and what we do is we look at the difference in that consumption, so that's what's here on the vertical axis. So it's the percent change in usage between, end of a month and the beginning of the month as a fraction of how much of the allowance you used. Okay? So let's first start kind of with people in this range, and I'll tell you exactly kind of where the numbers are, but people in this range. These are people that have used very small fraction of their allowance, right, by the time they've reached that kind of, the last 3 days. So for them, the shadow price is pretty close to 0, if not literally 0, right? Because what they're saying is, I don't know, think of someone over here. I've used 40% of my time, of my allowance, in 90% of the day, of the month, right? Because the first 27 months. So if I continue anywhere near my current trend, there's no way I'm going to exceed my allowance, right? So for them, it's 0. Now think of what happens when the clock restarts. For them, you might think actually the price goes up, right? Because they're sort of saying, maybe I was slow this month, next month it's actually going to be higher. Okay, so for them it's a price increase, but definitely not a decrease in the price. And you can see for them there's basically kind of a 0 response. I mean, it's noisy a little bit here, but it's basically 0. That's kind of this number here. What happens to these guys right here? These are the guys that are getting close to actually hitting the allowance, right? They're basically 3 days out. They're getting close to hitting the allowance. For them, the price, the last 3 days is higher than it is the first 3 days. And these are the guys you see have a reduction up to about 20% reduction in their usage. Okay, so they seem to really be responding to it. Okay, and I'll talk about a second. There's actually something that's a little bit uncomfortable as to where this starts. But let me talk about these last group of guys.
Comparing the last 3 days of the billing cycle to the first 3 days of the next billing cycle?
Of the next billing cycle, exactly. So it's kind of yes, exactly. Okay, so what you see is you see them, you go and the increase, right? So the last 3 days where your price is high, you're going to be, what happens kind of for these guys? So first of all, I should, this is a very noisy measure. There aren't that many guys out here, so it's very noisy, so I'm not sure there's anything. But if anything, you could say, well, being around here 0, these are consumers that you might think of, they're consuming very high this month, and if they're expecting that they're going to consume the same high amount next month, right, there's really no change in the shadow price. Or maybe these are guys just not paying attention. They don't particularly care, and for them, you can see they're basically, kind of it edges up to 0, but again, I should say this is very noisy. Now, one thing that's not, maybe all that great for us is if you look, this starts, where does this decrease starts, and this is kind of a smooth out version, so it's a bit hard to see exactly, but it's around 0.7, 0.75, okay? Which actually, if you think, is a little bit too soon, right? So if you basically, remember, these are the last 3 days, so there's basically 10% left on your time, and you're about 75% of a usage, you're still kind of ahead of usage, right? If anything, you'd expect the drop maybe a little bit further here. I don't know exactly where it is, because it depends a little bit on, how risk averse you are and how high the penalty is. But you might say it's a little bit too soon. Now remember, that's where you're going to get the warning, somewhere in that range. So it seems like once you get that warning, people do slow down, or at least maybe, yell at their kids to slow down. Okay, whoever is kind of using that. So we do see kind of a response here to this shadow price, and it does seem to kind of react kind of in a reasonable way. Okay, so that's kind of our, if you want our evidence to show that there seems to be some response to this shadow price variation.
You don't have like automatic cutoffs?
Sorry, you can.
You have automatic cutoffs if they reach some point?
You don't. They don't have that. I mean, you could do it manually by saying, give me a warning, and then I'm going to unplug the modem. Yeah. Here, as far as I know, they don't have that. You could do it manually by saying, give me the warning, and once you get the warning, you go and unplug it. But I don't think you can actually literally program that in. Okay. So average usage by hour and direction. That's the figure I thought I actually had early on. So this is now the average usage across, going from midnight to midnight. You can see here, this is kind of around, the prime time when people watch TV, do other things. That's also when you're using the internet. Okay? And this kind of peak use is, more than 5 times kind of what it is down here. Now, in terms of thinking of how you manage congestion, right, how do you kind of deal with this peak demand? Well, one thing you can do is you can buy these super big, think of it literally highways, right, but build these networks that have massive amounts of capacity, and they need to deal with this bill here. Not just that, this is an hourly level. The truth is, even within these hours, it could be huge peaks, so you need to even deal a lot more than that if you want to avoid congestion. Or one of the things you could do is say, well, is there a way to move this stuff to here? Not all of it, but if all we can do is just cut off a little bit of this head here and move that to this area, right, that would really save in terms of how much capacity we can build. Or for a given capacity, we could have a lot better performance. Okay, so then the question is, how are you going to build that here? And that's kind of what the second paper is mostly about, of saying, how can we move this part down here and move it by not necessarily building kind of bigger highways, but actually saying, let's try to find ways to use them more effectively. Okay, and obviously when you look at this, if you're kind of a micro-theorist or an IO economist, the very first thing that you're thinking about is probably peak use pricing. Is there a way to incentivize to basically say, let's instead of, price it accordingly, so use here can be moved there. Same type of problem, by the way, if you've ever looked at electricity papers, same exact problem that they're facing there. If you have these peak demand time periods, right, either because of air conditioning or everyone's home turning on their lights, and you want to figure out how to smooth that out. Exactly the same problem we have here. Might be easier to deal with here than it would with electricity, and I'll tell you in a second why. So let me show you a little bit, just some statistics in terms of how robust that result is of usage. So this is, again, same picture, but now I'm going to show you by deciles of the total usage distribution. So you might ask, does that pattern hold for everyone? And the answer is yes. It holds whether you're on the 3rd decile of total usage, that's these guys here, versus the 10th decile, right? Just in terms of do you still have that same pattern? And the answer is yes. So it's not correlated with total usage. Regardless of how much you use overall, everyone seems to have a peak around that same time, on average, within those deciles. On the other hand, if you look at what's the heterogeneity, so even though there's no correlation with total usage, there does seem to be a lot of heterogeneity in terms of the fraction of what you use. So what you have here, so the red kind of lines here, that's the median. This is the interquantile rate, so 25% to 50th, 75% of the proportion of the daily use on each of these hours. And then this blue, that gives you the 5 to 95%. So what you see here is you see a huge range of the proportion, right? And you can't quite see it, but you can infer, you can imagine, okay, some people have like the average, like the median, right? Some people maybe even have a much more skewed distribution. And others could actually have almost a flat distribution, right? Because remember, these are kind of linked. So if you're on the low end here, right, you could be on the high end there, right? So if I kind of plotted this out for given individuals, I can give you the whole range of anything from someone who does almost everything here to someone who does almost a flat or even more doing off-peak than peak. Okay, so again, that's another dimension in which there's massive amounts of heterogeneity in the data.
Weekend versus weekdays, probably.
Thank you. Couldn't have asked for better lead-in. So we thought there'd be a big difference. It ends up there isn't. And now we've seen this with like several data from several internet service providers. So this is different days of the week. So you see Saturday and Sunday are these days here. So there's a little bit of a flatter curve. So you see a little bit more during this time, but not, not completely flat. Okay. If you had asked us our prior before seeing that, we would have thought a little bit flatter, but it ends up that's not. And again, initially when we first saw it from one provider, we thought it might be a problem with their data. We've now seen it from 3 or 4 different providers from different time periods. Seems to be a pretty robust result. Okay, measuring network performance, because we're going to talk a little bit about that. There's a couple of different ways of doing that. What I'm going to be looking at is something called packet loss. So there is a measure that you can measure what number of packets don't actually arrive at the destination. Okay, so when you kind of download, whether it's a movie or a data set or a PDF file or just, you're watching, CNN, they send a certain amount of information. Part of it is lost. And there's a certain amount of redundancy in the system that it doesn't need to have 100% arrive. But it can't lose too much. So if you start losing more than 1% of the packets, you're going to start feeling it as a user. Okay, it means it has to reload, or you get this message, cannot load web page. So we actually have that as a constant measure of how much is lost, and it's going to be an individual specific measure in our data set.
But the ISP provider that gave you the data had also this measure, right? So how can, because you said before that the network was not congested, but they have this measure.
So remember, this is a few years ago when we first started working with them. Okay, and it actually wasn't this internet service provider. It was another one that, that we worked with. And yeah, so part of it, they've actually over time learned that they have to, come up with these other measures, not just the node measure. Okay, and there is going to be variation in this congestion. It's going to be both a cross-sectional across different nodes in the network. So some nodes are more congested than others. And there's also going to be a time series variation, which I'm going to exploit in a second because of investment in the network. Okay? So first, let me actually tell you. So this is, remember, one slide that I kind of shocked that they let us present, but this is it. So this is comparison across internet service providers. So this chart, so all the green bars are from the FCC. Okay, the purple one's the one we added. So the green bars are from the FCC. And what that is they basically show the quality of different networks as they measure, as the FCC measure, potentially using kind of this flawed measure. We're not exactly sure how they, well, actually this is using packet loss. So this is what they had. So we went there and computed one for our internet service provider. So it's not in the original data set the FCC has. We just said, okay, here's how our interpretation of what the FCC did, and we computed it for our guy. And you can see according to our measure, and this is not for their all network, it's in the market that we're focusing on, it would be the third worst on this FCC chart.
Not revealing the name of the ISP?
No. Well, because for one thing,
The FCC...
no, because that's why I said it's not on their data set. Okay? The green ones are from them. The purple is something we've produced. Okay? So at best, and even that's not true, at best you could say, we don't know who it is, but we know who it's not. Okay? But even that's not quite right because, it could be, for example, I don't know, Cablevision, except that this is the average across all of Cablevision's market, and this is just for our market. Okay? So that's a sense. I still was shocked that they let us do this, but it's still not. So you can't go, this is not on the original FCC. Okay? All the green ones were, we inserted this in, that's from our data.
How big are these numbers? I mean, when does it start to really interrupt?
Above 1%, it's basically unusable. Okay? And I'll show you actually specifically for our network kind of what it is. So above 1% packet loss, basically engineers tell us at that point, you know, you're going to tolerate it for a day or two, or, well, actually, I'll show you. I should be careful before I say that. 1%, you start actually feeling the pain. Okay? So you can see, and this is on average across all times of day, across all users. Okay? And I'll show you actually some heterogeneity in these numbers.
So just to understand, this is something like when you are watching, you know, a movie and it says buffering?
Yeah, so when it starts buffering, it means that it's either too slow or it's lost packet, so it has to go back and download. Or it means where you're pressed on a website, right? So sometimes you press on a website, boom, it appears instantaneously. Sometimes it takes a while to show up, and that's either because it hasn't arrived or the stuff that's arrived is incomplete, so it has to go back and say resend it.
So
Okay.
0.8 on average is huge.
Yes. Yeah.
Much of the time it is just not visible.
It's very annoyable. Okay? And I'll show you in a second. So the point of this graph is to show if we want to study congestion, you probably wouldn't want to be, you know, so you see Comcast is one of the better networks. Maybe, even though they're the largest, you know, you could say, well, maybe that's not the place to study. On their average, you want to go to a network that actually is congested. And the point is, our network is congested. Okay, so for our consumers, it's a problem.
Yeah, but probably what we care about is the fact that there is differences,
Yeah.
right? So perhaps even Comcast, there are some
Yeah.
places where it's
And remember, with 30-40% growth, if Comcast does nothing, they're going to become congested very soon. Okay, maybe a year, maybe two, but they're going to get there very soon. Okay, so packet loss by hour. So remember, that was the average numbers. Let me actually show you by the average by numbers, and then I'll show you a couple. So first, as you can see here, even in ours, so in ours, it averaged to about, just over 0.4 overall. But look at variation across the day. During peak time, on average, right, our average guy, our average person on our network is getting to the point of it's getting annoying, okay? If not even more than that. Okay, now during peak. During off-peak, they're okay. But even that's actually masking some heterogeneity. So what we have here, and there's different ways of describing this, what we're basically telling you is trying to describe not the average, but the tail. Okay, so to say what fraction of the population has over a 1% loss or over 0.2. So if you look at the over 1%, you can see that there's, it's right around 10% throughout most of the day. Okay, not, except kind of middle of the night, most of the day there's about 10% that get that 1% packet loss, right? So they have some annoying experience on that. And again, that's just an indication that A, there's heterogeneity, but also the fact that this is a pretty congested network. Okay.
I think there is a question.
Oh, yes.
Just one question. Is there, from looking at the data, is there a correlation between those providers that have a relatively high package loss and also provide both internet services and cable?
So almost all, so I don't know, because the packet loss, so what we have is just the aggregate data for the packet loss, and we could go back, and I don't think we've looked at it, but I think most of the internet service providers these days provide both. I think very few provide, and those that don't, they're probably the smaller guys, and therefore I don't know if it's the, just the smaller guys have, less investment, less, they're lower technologies.
So in terms of making,
Yeah.
keeping cable relatively more attractive.
Yep, and that's a great point, and I'll get back to it as kind of one of our future projects, because one of the data sets that we're just kind of, I say acquiring, we're not actually purchasing, but we're coming into us now is data. So here we know a lot about their internet usage. We know nothing about both what they subscribe to and their video use. The new data that we're getting, we have both their internet and their TV use. And one of the things you'd see there is there actually is some incentive for foreclosure, and we'll talk a little bit about that at the very end. We're kind of, that's our motivating for kind of the next project, if you want. Okay. So one last thing in terms of congestion. So this is kind of the overall congestion over time. And again here, this is kind of the median and then the plots of distribution. What you see here, there's a couple of bumps. This is the most notable, but there's a couple of other smaller ones where there's this decrease. These are what's called node splits. So it ends up, one of the ways that they can really deal with congestion is to say, you know, I'm with Carlos. Carlos really uses a lot of bandwidth. He slows down everyone on the network, on his node. So one of the things we could do is one day we say we're going to take Carlos and a few other poor souls and put them on a different node. Okay, and it frees the rest of us to have more bandwidth. So you see when they do that, you see this kind of, you know, sharp decrease, at least, you know, not in the tails, but at least on the kind of the median, kind of the middle of the distribution. And that gives us the opportunity to see, well, what happens, right, when I'm suddenly taken off this congested node, literally overnight, what happens to my usage? So one of the things that we found that once you do that, usage overall increases. Okay, and that's going to be a big part of our identification kind of for what we do later, is that usage overall actually increases. So it ends up congestion is a binding constraint for people. Okay, the fact that it's slowing down means that there's stuff that I'd like to be doing that I'm not. And actually the overall usage increases by about 10.5%. And what's more interesting actually is that the peak versus off-peak usage changes as well. So a lot of it basically means I'm going to increase more during peak, but I'm also increasing less during off-peak because maybe there was some things that I was doing off-peak that I would have liked to do during peak hours. And we see both of them in those node splits. Yes?
This also comes in, or at least partly, because applications like Netflix.
Yes. Yes. So part of it, I said here, kind of, I talked about if it's this active use. We can't separate whether it's me sort of saying I'm going to watch more movies or I watch the same number of movies, but Netflix, what they do is they realize that I have a better speed, so they're going to download it at a higher definition and therefore have more gigabytes. So we can't separate that, although one of the things, so, well, I talked through what these are. Let me just kind of, one of the things that, so these are the actual numbers that I talked through, what happens. So one of the things, so what we do here is we examine 7 days before, 7 days after this node split. One of the things we looked at is there's variation within that 7 days. So if we look at the 48 hours before and after, okay, there's actually very little going on there. So if it was just purely automatic, you wouldn't see an effect. Okay, but what we see is most of the action is actually in the outside that, that window. So it seems like there is some proactive response. Now, it could be that Netflix doesn't just look at your current connection. Maybe they have some memory. I don't know exactly how their algorithm, I don't think so. I think they literally adjusted by the speed of how you.
Explain that. What does Netflix do? They adjust the...
So suppose you're watching a movie, whatever your actually don't tell us what your favorite movie is. It's don't want to know. You're watching that, yeah. Whatever your wife watches, and Netflix realized you're on a slow connection. So depending on your settings, but if it's on the automatic setting, they would download it at a lower definition. But if they now discover you have a high-speed connection, they'll increase it to a higher. Again, if you're at your default, you can adjust that. But if you didn't adjust, they'll kind of do it both ways. Okay, so that's kind of one way in which, and Netflix is just an example. There's other applications that have that as well that can substitute according to how, you know, what's the quality of your speed. So basically what you see here is that there's overall increase in peak usage, there's a small decrease in off-peak usage, and actually if you look in terms of percentage, it's even a little bit bigger. So there does seem to be some substitution to this off-peak. Okay, the Netflix explanation won't tell you why this is going down, could maybe explain what is going up, but not kind of the break within the day. Okay, now where is this going to? What's the use? So this is a different data set that for this provider, we don't actually have that. So most of it is video. Okay, over 55% of, thank you, of what goes on the internet is video. So it's either Netflix or YouTube or stuff like that. The next largest is various web browsing, and then everything else is much smaller. Okay? And the reason this is important, besides just knowing this, is the fact that if you think in terms of the ability to move stuff, video, right? So Netflix is a buffering service. Okay, it's not a download service. Okay, but suppose you can actually turn it to say, I want to watch, or you know, your wife wants to say, I want to watch a certain movie tonight. Why don't we download it in the middle of the night, the day before? And even if it lets you sit there for a week, right, not knowing exactly where it is, That's the way to move. So move it down if the technology existed. It mostly does not exist today. Okay, but if you, well, no, just a second. If you knew what you could watch and you had incentives to do that, right, the equivalent of saying, you know, in electricity of saying you load your dishwasher and have it run in the middle of the night, right? You have a timer on it, right? You'd want to have that basically for Netflix to do that. Yes?
But you can do that with Netflix.
It started recently. So recently they started, and for a limited number of, not all their content. Okay, so it's a recent thing, and at least, again, maybe it's different in Europe, but in the US, it's for limited content, and part of the issue is their agreement with the studios and the content providers. The real reason they didn't actually offer initially, and they offered a buffering system, is they're worried about the ability to hack the content. Okay, if you're buffering, it's, I'm told, and I don't understand the engineering part of it, I'm told it's much harder to hack it. Although I don't, personally, I don't understand why. I don't understand why you could put an intercept basically between the DVR and the video to just say, capture everything, you know, think of the equivalent of having, you know, screenshots that you could have on your phone. Just think of having a video version of that. I can't imagine why you can't have that, but apparently you can't, or it's much harder to do, so that's why they do it. Now, so Netflix recently, and this is in the last few months, we always say it's because they read our paper, but, you know, and I'll stick to that until proven otherwise, but they start offering that, but again, on a limited basis. Okay? So, so the point here is that some of this content you could actually move if you create the right incentive. So what this paper is about is saying, how do we create those right incentives?
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
The ISP. So do they throttle in any way depending on content? Because,
No.
for example, mine here, Orange, what they clearly do is that with app updates and app downloads, they're super slow in peak hours. If I use VPN so that they don't know I'm doing it,
Yeah.
it's quite fast.
Yeah.
So they're clearly basically throttling.
So they don't, but that's one of the things we'll explore, you know, the effect of that. Although not exactly that, it's different. We'll look at throttling speed, but a different.
Because that, I mean, these are automatic, so I don't really care so much whether it's off peak
Yeah.
or on peak, so they can just slow it down.
Yeah. Yeah. So I don't. I do know that actually, but that might be that, you know, I don't know. It could be. I do know that most of my app updates happen at night when the phone is. But I don't know if actually it's night or they usually do it when the phone is charging, and I usually leave it overnight charging. So I think I'm not sure what triggers it actually. Okay. So what are the key takeaways from the data? Just a few things. First, there's substantial heterogeneity, and I showed you some of it across users and possibly every different dimension. And that has both a modeling implication, that we want to model, we want to have a rich heterogeneity, but also in terms of the economics, if you think of, is there potential for price discrimination? The answer is yes. And because there's a lot of heterogeneity, it could also be welfare enhancing, right? Because you want to actually tailor pricing, you know, to not have some consumers subsidize others. This pattern that we saw really suggests peak load pricing. Dynamics seem to be some response to it. And congestion, is it exists, and consumers do seem to respond when we reduce it just from this reduced form evidence. So we're going to try and see, well, can we learn about what the economic effect of that would be? So I'm going to write down a model. I'll just kind of really give you a taste of it. This is the part where I'm going to speed up a bit so we have some more time for discussion. So the goal of the model is to use variation in the shadow price over the month to estimate demand. The model is either going to be daily, or the one that I'm going to focus on is going to be between peak and off-peak usage. And there's also going to be a plan choice, although it's going to be a very simple plan choice component to it. We're going to need to have a lot of heterogeneity. And the key elements of the model are the following. There's going to be utility from content, and I'll show you in a second how we model that. There's going to be a cost of usage that's going to be related to the value of time. Okay? Because otherwise you might ask why, you know, the price of 0, why don't I price, you know, why don't I consume infinity? Right? Why is there a finite number of gigabytes at a download? And the idea is that it actually takes time to absorb that content, and that's going to create some satiation. Connection speed is going to be related to the value of time, so that's how we're going to feed in connection speed as part of our model. There's going to be some random shocks to explain why we see a lot of this variation. Plan choice, we're going to assume is optimal, and I'll show you kind of in a second. This goes back to the point that there's very few mistakes that we see. So we're going to actually make it, not even have a logit error term. We say literally you choose the plan that maximizes your discounted utility. And as I said, there's given the data we have, there's very little evidence that we can contradict that. Okay? So how are we going to do this? So this is, let me show you the utility function that we have when you consume both off-peak and during peak. Okay, so you're going to get a utility from consumption. It's going to be this guy here. And whether you consume off-peak, during peak or off-peak, you're going to get the same utilities, right? So it's additive in that. And there's going to be some curvature to this demand, or this utility, denoted by this alpha h, right? So we can expand anything from linear to kind of a log demand. Okay, so that's going to be the utility. Then there's going to be these two components of cost, and they're going to vary between off-peak and peak. So let me just focus on peak for a second. So during peak demand, you can see there's going to be a cost that's going to be quadratic in cost, in the kind of how much you consume, and explain in a second why we need it quadratic, and times a coefficient here. Kappa is a household-specific coefficient for essentially your value of time. Okay? And it's going to be divided by the speed, and speed is going to be multiplied by the network space. So network state, not space. Network state. So the idea is that this is your advertised speed, and we're going to hit that by how much your network is slowed down. Okay? But the idea is the following. It basically says that based on your kappa, there's going to be an optimal level of consumption, even if you have an optimal network and optimal speed, right? So even, and zero price, right? So even sort of say you don't pay anything, you're not going to consume an infinite amount, which is what you would get if you just had this utility, right? Instead of saying, yes, you always have a decreasing marginal utility, but you always have a utility, but at some point you're going to hit this cost of consumption. That's going to be your optimal level of consumption. And the cost is going to vary between peak and off-peak. So it's going to vary in two ways. During off-peak, we're going to kind of hit this cost of time. We're going to hit it by this parameter, in some sense increases the cost of your time. Okay, so think of the fact that you say, well, I could come home and watch a Netflix movie during working hours, but supposedly the shadow value of your time is higher during that time. The opportunity cost of your time is higher, so we're going to account for that. And that's why you're not watching it there, even though the utility is the same, right? It's just that the cost is higher, and that's why you're doing that. And the other thing is, during off-peak, you're going to get your advertised speed, the one you actually pay for, and we're not going to, discount with the network. Okay? And the reason we have quadratic on these costs is because you want to actually have that you're not in a corner solution, right? So you need to have a quadratic cost that you're actually going to be in an interior solution for both of these. Okay? So essentially what we have is we're going to have a consumer type, and a consumer is going to be characterized by these 5 different parameters. This is going to be the curvature of a utility function, which is really going to be the elasticity of the price elasticity of demand. That's really what's going to come from here. This is going to be your opportunity cost of time, or how much you care about speed. And these are going to be 3 parameters that hit, sorry, I didn't say that. We're going to have 2 stochastic terms here. One is this V2, which is the cost of your time, and V1 is a shock that hits your marginal utility. So you have different marginal utilities on different days. Okay, and both of these are going to be random shocks, and which we're going to assume are going to be independent normals with different means, but a common coefficient of variation. And the reason we have that is we kind of limit the number of parameters that we have. So a household, each house is going to have a different vector of these parameters. And the idea is with different values of these, you can generate very, very rich patterns of behavior, right, that has essentially heterogeneity in pretty much every one of the dimensions that I showed you. Okay? And what we want is we want to have, saying each of these is going to be very rich, and now what we want is to have a very flexible distribution in the population for that. And I'll show in a second how we're going to model that. Okay, how do we solve the model? So for a given type of household, we're going to solve the model backwards. So basically, conditional on plan choice, this is a finite horizon problem. So we basically say, what do you consume in the last period, right? And if the last period is, peak use on the last day, that's just a static problem, and then we kind of work backwards from that. Okay, I can send you details, or it's kind of in the paper. And then we solve, for the optimal usage on each of the offered plans. Plan choice, we can ask, well, going back to the first day of the month, what's the expected value that you get from each of these plans? and say you choose the plan with the highest expected value. Okay, that's the plan choice. Okay, and again, there's more details in the paper that I skipped of exactly how to do that. How are we going to estimate? So let me just talk about the overview, maybe talk a little bit about the details. So how we're going to estimate this? So we're going to follow kind of this kind of a panel data modification of something called a fixed grid approach that was offered by Pat Byrie, Jeremy Fox, and others, and that we use in our first paper. And what this does here is the following. There's two steps. The first step is a pure computational, okay, no estimation at all. What we do is for each of these types, so we take a fixed grid of these types. Okay, we're going to take in this paper almost 8,000 types that are going to be defined basically by a grid over these 6 parameters. So for each of these, we compute what is the optimal behavior. Okay, and this is just now, it's a theory problem, right? Think of it as a numerical problem saying for each of these types, what's the optimal solution? How would they behave? Okay, so we do that for, again, about 8,000 types. And for them, we store various things from their behavior, their optimal plan, their policy function, and various things like that. Okay. Then we go to the estimation. And the estimation is saying for these fixed types, we now have to figure out how to predict the behaviors that we see in the data. So for each household, we basically go and ask, what is the likelihood that their data was generated from each of these 8,000 types?
So for each household, you have 8,000 different probabilities, some to one.
So for each household, we have 8,000 different likelihoods. It's actually not 8,000. I'll show you in a second why not. But for each of these, we have a likelihood, and then we basically take the probability and essentially normalize, divide by the sum of the likelihood. So the likelihoods don't sum up to 1, but we basically, the weights that we give sum up to 1. Okay, and essentially what we do is I'm going to call posterior, and I'll explain to you in a second why, and then that's for each household. Then we can aggregate over the household and say what's the probability in the population. Okay, so suppose for Carlos it ends up, the data tells me most likely he's one of, of 2 types. Okay, 50% of this, 50% of that. Massimo could be 50% of one of these types and 50% of another type. Okay, so I'm going to aggregate in the population. From that, I would say there's 50% on the common type and then 25% on the others. So I get kind of a population distribution on that. Okay, so that's kind of the estimation. That's some of the details. Let me kind of skip over that. Okay, and again, you can sort of see in the paper, but essentially, this you can see here, that's the probability. It's kind of these likelihoods, and I'm dividing by. Okay, so what's kind of the identification here? So let me try to explain kind of the intuition of what's going on here. By starting with the grid, you can think of what I'm doing is I'm kind of putting a flat prior saying, I have a flat prior over these 8,000 types, the distribution in the population. Okay? Then I go and say, each of these guys is going to choose a particular plan. Okay, it ends up in my model, there's a one-to-one mapping between a type, right? A type is a vector of 5 parameters, and the plan that they choose. Okay, so I can divide the state space, these 8,000, into those consumers who are not going to choose anything, and those that are going to choose one of the plans. Okay, now I know the market share of each plan, so essentially I know how much mass is on each of these groups, but it's uniform, right? So if I have 10 types that choose tier 1, and then tier 1 has 20%, each of them has a 2% probability. Okay, if I have 20 types that choose plan 2, but there's 30% market share, again, different probabilities. Okay, so it's kind of flat within that type. And then I go to this likelihood of the usage, so then I have to divide just by the likelihood, not of all the types, but in that area, to essentially refine that posterior distribution. Okay, so that's kind of, if you want, that's how we're, think of it, I start with a prior, then bring in the plan information, that will give me these blocks of flats, and then I bring the usage, and that's going to give weights within that area. Okay, so how do I summarize the weights? I think this is a place where it's easiest to do it in pictures, because remember, at the end of the day, I have something like 8,000 different parameters, because I have a weight for each of these types in the population, so it's easiest just to show by figures. So these are the marginal distributions for 2 of the types. U2, that's the U2, that's the mean of that cost during off-peak. Okay, so the key thing here, without kind of looking at the values, we can interpret that, is to say, well, this kind of looks like sort of a normal, but not really, kind of a little bit skewed. If you look at the marginal of alpha, that's the parameter in the utility. That's directly the curvature of the utility function. You can see here, this kind of looks like a bimodal. Maybe you could say, well, there's kind of a normal here and a normal there. Okay, but the key point is we saw a lot of heterogeneity, and it's not easy to describe with parametric distributions, or even just saying, well, just assume there's 2 or 3 types in the population. Yes?
I think I have a related question which I wanted to ask before. So you model households as a kind of like a unified group. Many households contain, not houses,
Yeah.
many households contain multiple people. The marginal person
Yep.
is different from the average person, so this could kind of give rise to
Yeah.
things that we
So what I'm looking at, and so one of the ways to think about this, so let me talk about this for a second and then get back directly to your question. So here what I have, this is the joint distribution of the 2 marginals that I showed you. And once again, you can see here, and this is just 2 of the dimensions. Once you look at this, you could say, okay, suppose I force you to do something more parametric. You might say, well, I want to have a mixture of normals and hope that, you know, one normal is going to be peaked here and another normal over there. Okay, maybe. But otherwise, it's going to be very hard to figure out how do I model, how do I get this type of distribution. Okay? Now, this is the population distribution. Now, one way to think about what we're doing is to say, because remember, I get these posteriors for each household. So you could say, suppose I had infinite data. Would I end up with one type for each household? And the answer is not necessarily, right? I could end up that basically you could say, you know, Carlos, and I'm sorry to keep picking at you, but you could say your household, right? So A, you could say either Carlos's behavior is really a mixture of 2 types. He's neither one of the, he's not any one of the individuals, it's a mixture. Or you could sort of say, well, Carlos's household, there's 4 people there, right? So it's a mixture of these 4. Each of them is at one type, but there's a mixture of them, right? And in that sense, you know, I don't really care because I'm aggregating up to the population and trying to see what is the distribution in the population. Now, you're right in the sense of if there's difference between the marginal and the average, I mean, you know, you could say maybe those weights are a little bit different of how much you have to do. Yes, that could be a problem, but we already have a very rich model that allows us, you know, in principle could pick that up. Okay? So that's the distribution that we get, and I think, again, the key here is we gave it a lot of flexibility, and the model wanted it to kind of pick up the data. Okay, so what are the implications of the estimates? Let me just go through a few of them. I know I'm running out of time, so I'm not going to show you all of them. So first of it, having internet access is very valuable. We can compute that from the numbers, and we get slightly different numbers. But for example, in our first paper, the econometric one, if we compute the consumer surplus from free, if you gave you fiber to the home for free, this is what your willingness to pay for that, right? For free, I mean in the sense of what the consumer surplus would be generated. Demand under that would be very valuable. So that was, you know, for free, or if you get the typical cable speed, you know, a little bit less than that, but actually still a fair bit of money in that. What's interesting, though, is that the marginal usage is not very valuable. So there's a very big difference between inframarginal and marginal. So if we actually looked at how much your willingness to pay for kind of things on the margin in terms of allowance and what your utility from the marginal content, it's very low. And it kind of makes sense once you sort of say that, right? It's saying there's some things that I'm using the internet that are very valuable for, but on the margin, kind of watching another cat video is not all that valuable, right? So I really want to get, you know, internet because I really have to check my my email or, you know, be able to edit my files at home. But then on the margin, you know, maybe I'm not getting that much value. In terms of willing to pay for speed, there differ a little bit between our 2 papers, and it could be, again, because it's slightly different settings. But at least in this kind of more recent paper, it's actually not all that much kind of your willingness to pay for advertised speed as opposed to kind of realized speed. That actually is going to matter. And again, the willingness to pay for additional gigabyte of allowance is actually not all that high, which actually has implications. I'm not going to talk much about the 0 rating of content. Ends up maybe it's not that big of a deal, because what you're doing with 0 rating is saying some things are going to count, some are not, so maybe that's not that big of a deal. Okay, in terms of willingness to pay for eliminating congestion, actually it ends up those numbers are pretty high. So even though you're not willing to pay a lot for advertised speed, you are willing to pay for getting, in some sense, the realized speed. So we can simulate the model, how much you're willing to pay to get the actual realized speed, what you paid for, to actually get it at high peak time. And what we're finding is on the average number is about $15 with a lot of heterogeneity here. That's kind of the distribution willingness to pay. So again, congestion seems to be something that consumers are willing to pay for. Usage-based pricing, again, what we found there was that actually it seems to be a pretty effective way to eliminate very low kind of marginal utility content, okay? Because essentially what it means is it kind of forces you to pay on the margin if you're a high user, and ends up that marginal content not very valuable. So it's actually, it does lower consumer welfare, but not by that much, and actually seems to create kind of more, kind of if you look at the sum of consumer surplus plus revenue, it's actually beneficial. But let me kind of skip that. Investment in network, this was kind of our first paper. What we found was that the next generation network was socially beneficial, but there was a large difference in private and social returns. So that might actually leave some scope for some form of intervention, although I think, again, the second paper proposed you want to be smart about how you do it, not just build kind of this, you know, big highways, but actually think about maybe economic ways of managing that. Okay, so how do we manage kind of moving this peak? So we tried a couple of things, and let me just talk through them and show you the results from the last one. So the first thing we tried is throttling. So it said, what happens if once you exceed your allowance, we're going to start slowing you down? So it's not exactly the throttling you talked about. It's not within high peak. We just say it is going to be during high peak, but only once you exceed the usage. It ends up that doesn't do much. Actually, if anything, has the reverse estimate, because it ends up that you don't care that much about speed in our estimates, and this provider charges so much for overage that you actually would rather have slowing down than have to pay. So it actually has the reverse effect. Okay, so skip that. How about peak use pricing? Well, peak use pricing doesn't do much in terms of the effect. So this is basically the baseline compared to a 25% reduction. So what we do is it's peak use pricing. So you only pay for the allowance for peak use, not for off-peak. But to have any bite, we also have to reduce your peak, what your allowance is. So we're going to reduce your allowance either by 25 or by 50%. The key here is that it doesn't do much to overall consumption. And you can see shifts a little bit kind of peak to off-peak, but really not, isn't really working all that much. And part of the story here is it's not working because you don't have the technology. So yes, you might have incentives to download Netflix, but you don't have the technology to do that. So what we want to ask is, suppose you had that technology. So that's what we do, kind of this last thing, which we introduce a local caching technology. Think of it like a DVR for Netflix. And the way we can do that is by, you remember that cost that we have? We can say, suppose that cost, the mean of that cost is very different. So it's either 25% of what it currently is or 50%. Right? So we can simulate something that we don't see in the data. And the bottom line of this is actually pretty effective in terms of usage. So it increases overall usage, but you can see it reduces peak usage and increases off-peak usage. Now, part of the reason why it doesn't decrease peak usage as much is there's two effects here. It's more costly, or so you have this technology to move, but also because it's less congested, the network, it's actually now, you know, there's a counterbalancing, an equilibrium effect. And,
Shouldn't they sample 3.2?
They should, and they probably don't just because maybe we're averaging over slightly different populations, but yeah, I should check that. They should. I'm not sure why they don't, because they do elsewhere, so yeah. So it's probably just a typo, okay, but yeah. Okay, so let me just conclude, because I know we kind of wanted to keep, have a little bit of time for questions. So overall, you know, this combination of the data and modeling are very useful in addressing policy relevant questions that are not, you know, that we don't have experiments in the data that we could just say, let's just look at the data. Still many unanswered questions. So for example, you know, our estimates suggest that local caching is going to make over-the-top video more attractive. But that sort of says, well, if it's going to make it more attractive, at what point, this goes back to the question you asked earlier, at what point does the internet service provider realize, well, wait a second, I'm kind of competing with myself here, right? And they're actually worried about it because there is a trend in the US of cord cutting. And what happens is when people cut their video cord, so no longer have video, no longer have TV, they use a lot more of the internet. So what they're saying and what these guys are realizing, if you're going to watch ESPN from a cost perspective, it's a lot cheaper if you watch it on the TV portion of the bandwidth and not on the data port, okay? Just from an engineering perspective. So they're actually realizing they're kind of shooting themselves in the foot twice. A, because they're losing your revenue from the TV because you're not paying it anymore, and they're increasing their cost. Okay? So at some point you can say, well, on one hand that creates maybe incentives for them to price correctly. On the other hand, at some point you start thinking, are they going to have incentive for foreclosure and saying, we're not going to allow over-the-top video, we're going to sort of slow it down, right? And there's kind of mixed thing. On one hand, they don't want to do that because that lowers your internet experience. On the other hand, you know, they do want to shift you somehow to video, and that's going to create kind of very interesting incentives, and that's kind of the next paper is going to try to look exactly at those questions. Yes?
There's also a third effect because there's bargaining between these providers
Yep.
and, for example, ESPN.
Yep.
So in a sense, you could almost threaten to make
Yep.
bandwidth.
That's a very good point, yep. Yeah, because there are, you know, they do have a bargaining on what the rates would be, and it kind of goes both ways, right? You know, ESPN could say, hey, if you don't give us the rates we want, we're going to offer over-the-top video, and you're going to be screwed. On the other hand, the internet service provider says, well, we potentially could throw, but with net neutrality in the mix, there's a limited amount of what they can do, right? So they can't just go and say, we're going to slow down ESPN specifically, right? ESPN.com or whatever that app will be. But you could imagine saying, we're just going to have congested networks. So it's not just going to slow you down, but it's going to slow video guys more than others. And then this leads to the whole question of, suppose ESPN or Netflix comes in and say, we want to pay for a fast lane. Should you allow for that or not? And these are all, you know, these are not made up questions. Again, I don't know what it is in Europe, but I suspect it's exactly the same questions that we're having in the US right now of whether these things should be allowed. What, you know, what is net neutrality? How should we define it? Should we hold it? And that exactly touches on these topics. Yes, Rosa.
So two related questions. So local cache makes a lot of sense for Netflix, but then
Yeah.
what we do is we cannot really anticipate which videos are going to become viral and download them beforehand, right? So and then related to this, there is an externality in if Netflix does it, then it's making prestigious developers not for the other providers in a sense.
Yeah.
There should be a way to, there's going to be suboptimal local caching.
Yes. So, so first on YouTube, you know, YouTube, you know, so you and I probably have the same view of, okay, YouTube, you go watch these kind of short videos that kind of, in the spur of a minute, you kind of say, oh, I want to show how you do something in LaTeX, and there might be a video showing how to do that, or how to repair your, you know, a clogged sink. That's true, but on the other hand, I know I watch my kids, how they use YouTube. For them, they would watch things that you don't have on Netflix, right? So some pirated, I mean, it's not really pirated movie. Someone puts, you know, a movie of something, and they watch, so they could, in principle, you know, predict just like you could on Netflix, or to the same degree, at least some of it. Now remember, the other thing is, we don't need to get all of that. All we need is to move some of that to the other parts, and that would help. In terms of the externalities, yes, I agree. Kind of a general point here is there's a lot of different players, and there's a lot of different incentives, right? So we want to reduce the congestion for the internet service provider, right? But the question is, do we want Netflix to introduce the technology? Now it ends up Netflix itself would also like to do it, just because they have the same problem on their own servers, right? That everyone wants to download movies during high periods, so they have to build a lot of capacity on their servers. So they would prefer if you moved some of that to other times as well. So that's kind of a way to live it. But I agree with you. There's a lot of incentive flowing around here and a lot of externalities, and the question is, how do you solve all of them?
Other questions or comments? Sandro?
I have one question. I can still not understand one feature of the framework. So your internet speed mechanically determines how much you can potentially use internet, right? In terms of gigabytes.
Yeah.
I traveled 1,000 miles this year. Speed of my car will determine kind of my maximum capacity. Where does this show up in your estimation? The fact that they have slower.
So in the, so if you literally, yeah, so if you literally went and, you know, had it being downloaded at full time, I mean, you'd exceed your allowance by a lot, even if you have relatively slow
But
speed.
let's think about just
Yeah.
peak times.
Yeah, but during peak time, what it basically shows up is here, right? So forget for a second this, right? So you see I'm dividing basically your cost by the log of the speed, and that's going to determine what your optimal consumption is at any, suppose, forget for a second price. Okay, suppose it's a price of 0, you would still have a finite optimal consumption for kind of any speed, right? And how much that impacts really is hit by this kappa, which is your opportunity cost of time, right? And you're right that, you know, if it's, well, if you literally take it 0, then, you know, we're not sort of solved. So you don't want to have 0, you want to have some opportunity cost of time. But if, as you vary that opportunity cost of time, you know, your speed will determine your optimal usage. So it's not really as much technological, you know, it solves in there, but I guess we could check to make sure that we're not violating, you know, some optimal, but I just can't believe that that would be the case, because again, remember, we're fitting this, at least the types that get weights are such that the kappa is such that, you know, you'd fit some behavior in the data, so it can't be that you're totally violating a technological constraint. Okay. Any other?
Yeah, just coming back to a very early thing, and maybe it's too technical, but for the small subsample of those that switch contracts, in a sense, for the same time of the month, you observe 2 shadow prices. Can you make use of this? Or
We don't. I don't know that you have 2 shadow prices. I mean, you do have a decision of saying, I can switch, right? And then it gets a little bit of a complicated decision because, you know, if you switch and you basically say, you know, because the way they do these guys is they actually get the new allowance. So if you're actually flexible enough and willing to, you know, it's literally costless to you, what you should be doing is you, well, it depends on the speed, but you should choose whatever speed you want or the minimum speed you're willing to accept, and then take that minimal plan and then upgrade if you need according to the allowance. So the dynamic problem becomes pretty complicated because you have to think about the future, right? You know, do you have a cost? Are you stuck in the state or not? So it ends up, it's so, that behavior is so, there's so few people who do it that we just kind of left it. And I think at some point we didn't see anything very strategic or very interesting in it, so we just kind of left it alone.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.